Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jean Rhys's short story on not shooting sitting birds. I say short story, it's really more flash fiction. This is very, very short. It's also very, very uncomfortable because this is basically the story of a date that does not go well. Does not go the way that the narrator of the short story expected it to. Yeah, it's a bad date. So, the narrator of the story seems to be. So the narrator of the story is from the Caribbean, possibly Dominica. I don't remember if it specifically establishes that. Oh, yes, Dominica. So that's where Rhys was from. So she's drawing on her own sort of background, her own childhood experiences. But the narrator has come to England. She meets this guy. So it says here, I met this young man who smiled at me, and when we talked a bit, I agreed to have dinner with him in a couple of days' time. I went home excited, for I'd liked him very much, and began to plan what I should wear. I had a dress I quite liked, an evening cloak, shoes, stockings, but my underclothes weren't good enough for the occasion, I decided. So we initially have this sexual tension, right? The fact that the narrator is thinking about her underwear in the context of this first date suggests where she anticipates or hopes or plans this is going to go. So the next day I went out and bought the Milanese silk chemise and drawers, and then we get to the actual date itself. So there we were, seated at a table having dinner with a bedroom very obvious in the background. He was younger than I'd thought and stiffer, and I didn't like him much after all. So again, we have that very clear sexual tension. The narrator has chosen the right underwear, which is kind of not that important if you don't anticipate your date seeing it. I guess there's an argument to be made that when you wear nice underwear, you feel better about yourself. You may be more confident. You may be happier, more relaxed, whatever it is. But I think realistically, we kind of have to read this as the purpose of choosing the right underwear for a date is that you intend your date to see them. And then we have this line, seated at a table having dinner with a bedroom very obvious in the background. Yeah. So we have this setup in which this narrator likes this guy. She thinks that things are going to go along. And then immediately we have this turn. Immediately it shifts to, he was younger than I'd thought and stiffer, and I didn't like him much after all. Suddenly the date is very uncomfortable. It has gone from, I like this guy, I potentially want to have sex with this guy, to, yeah, not my cup of tea. And it does that in one line. There is, within this paragraph, it goes from, here's the bedroom, I don't like him. It's a very stark shift. Really, really effective as a rhetorical technique for putting the audience in this space of discomfort that the narrator is experiencing on this date. And then there's this weird moment. Which we can only assume is this sort of English bias against people from the colonies, even white people from the colonies. He said, but you're a lady, aren't you? Exactly as he might have said, but you're really a snake or a crocodile, aren't you? It's this weird moment. I don't fully know what to make of it. And the only thing I can think is This means even though you're from the Caribbean, you're still a lady. Can I trust that you are a lady, even though you are from the colonies and you are not from England? And I mean, Rhys was from, her ancestry was British. Her father was Welsh. But she was not English. She was not from Britain itself. And that was an issue that Rhys experienced in her own life. So again, this is sort of drawing on the narrator's sense of displacement in Britain. But then we get this story that the narrator decides to tell. And it's an interesting choice of story because, as she says here, before I came to England, I'd read many English novels, and I imagined I knew all about the thoughts and tastes of various sorts of English people. In Rhys's short story, The Day They Burned the Books, which I've done a video about previously, one of the central ideas of that is the British education system within the colonies, particularly in the Caribbean and Africa, in which British literature, or European literature, classical literature more than modern European literature, but British literature especially, was used to establish a sort of romanticized conception of Britain and to show the superiority of Britain over the colonies and over colonials. So we have this theme brought back here, this sense that I have been taught all about England, and yet I cannot effectively navigate it because what I have been taught is literature. It is idealization rather than reality, the day-to-day experiences of being a British person. But she goes on, she says, I quickly decided that to distract or interest this man, I must talk about shooting. It's actually not a terrible strategy given how much shooting parties, hunting parties, things like this show up in British literature and then in contemporary British heritage type TV shows and movies and things like that. It shows up all the time. There are hunting parties, shooting parties in things like Downton Abbey, in Father Brown, in the more recent Miss Marple with Geraldine McEwen and what's the other one's name? The other actor who takes over as Miss Marple partway through. Anyway, like these British shows set in the past, whether that's the 50s, the 20s, the 1900s, the Victorian era places, times like this, there's typically a shooting party. So we still see this as this sort of conceptualization of British culture. What seems like it has occurred here, though, so the narrator tells him about this shooting party where she sort of tagged along following her brothers in Dominica. She's lying about some of the stuff. Like, she makes it seem more grand than it was, but also she tells us, the readers, that she was actually scared of the sound of the guns. And so whenever her brothers would go to shoot, she would sort of dash behind a bush and plug her ears. So she never actually saw the shooting itself. And then, so she's describing her brothers like traipsing through the forests, shooting at these pigeons, these parrots, these various West Indian birds. And it says here, on and on I went, almost believing what I was saying, when he interrupted me. Do you mean to say that your brothers shot sitting birds? His voice was cold and shocked. I stared at him. How could I convince this man that I hadn't the faintest idea whether my brothers shot sitting birds or not? How could I explain now what really happened? If I did, he'd think me a liar, also a coward, and there he'd be right, for I was afraid of so many things, not only the sound of gunfire. By this time, I wasn't sure that I liked him at all, so I was silent and felt my face growing stiff and unsmiling as his. It was a most uncomfortable dinner. We both avoided looking at the bedroom, and when the last mouthful was swallowed, he announced that he was going to take me home. The way he said this rather puzzled me. Then I told myself that probably he was curious to see where I lived. Neither of us spoke in the taxi except to say, well, good night. Good night. So, your brothers shot sitting birds question is this like minor point of British hunting etiquette where it's perfectly fine to kill as many defenseless birds as you want as long as they are flying when you shoot them. If they're on tree branches, if they're on the ground, whatever it is, then it's not sporting. I get the logic of this. The logic is that it's harder to hit a flying bird than it is to hit a bird on a branch or on the ground or something like this. But it is a minor point of shooting etiquette. And yet it seems to color this guy's entire conception of her. It seems like it totally changes. Well, it's hard to say totally changes because it's not clear that he was particularly interested in her either. Again, this is part of the overall awkwardness of the date, but this seems to be the thing that decides it for him. That because her brothers shot sitting birds, she must just be an uncultured colonial, would not be somebody worth sleeping with, let alone dating. And so it's a very interesting culture clash here over something that, in a way, is not that important a distinction. From the perspective, if you look at hunting as we are attempting to shoot particular things in order to eat them, use their resources in some way, if this is a harvesting type thing, it's completely unimportant. But if this is, we are shooting flying birds, we're shooting birds on the wing because we are sportsmen, then it matters. And yet, from the bird's perspective, it makes no difference.